Welcome to the Illuminate Universe podcast. The cast. Get it? The cast? Yes, we have a cast of celebrity professionals and entrepreneurs on this show. My name is Alina, and I'm the founder of Illuminate Universe, where we mentor job seekers and help employers to fast track their business goals. For this episode in particular, I have invited Pei Li, who is a co-founder of Venue, the platform powering internal meetings that inspire and engage remote-first teams. Pei and his team raised over $4 million USD in seed funding and are thriving in the tech startup sphere. Venue is accepted into the Y Combinator, one of the best and world-class startup accelerators. Pei will share today about the importance of developing key skills and attributes that will help you be prepared and thrive in the future of work. We start off from his journey as an immigrant growing up in Canada to becoming a Wealthsimple engineer and dropping out of school, and finally to where he is today. Before further ado, please welcome Pei onto our show today. Hi, Pei. Thank you so much for attending our podcast today. It's such an honor to have you here. To start off, my first question for you is, tell us about your immigrant story. What was it like growing up in Canada? Did you always know that you were going to become an entrepreneur one day?
Honestly, I had no idea what I was going to do for most of my life, probably up until university. Growing up, I didn't have an idea of what career I wanted. With Asian parents, you only get a few options, right? They were like, you would be a doctor or engineer or lawyer or something of that sort. So I didn't really have an understanding of what any of that meant. And all I really knew was like, whatever I did, it needed to make money. My parents struggled with money growing up. Both of them came from a farming village. So my grandparents were farmers. My great-grandparents were farmers. Everyone before them were farmers. My parents were the only two from the village to actually go to university. Before that, no one in the village actually made it out of the village. And which kind of made sense because before their generation, it was still like under Mao's rule, and yeah, they didn't really have opportunity. But my first exposure to entrepreneurship was actually a really weird one. It was from SpongeBob. And you might remember the episode, but there was an episode where SpongeBob received a magazine about like entrepreneurship and how like it made a boatload of money. So he was like, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. And he started selling chocolates all around the neighborhood. Sounds like it makes money. And it sounds like it makes sense. You know, you buy something and you resell it for more money. I can see how it's scalable. You know, you don't just make a salary. So I was like, that's an interesting idea. I want to be an entrepreneur. But you know, that's just how a child thinks. In high school, the first time I actually did something entrepreneurial was in grade 9. There was a vending machine across the street from my high school that sold soda pops, right? So you could buy it like a Coca-Cola for 50 cents. So I love Coke. So I was like, I would go every lunch period with 50 cents, like 2 quarters, put in the vending machine, and buy the Coke. And then once in a while, the store that owned the vending machine would sell cases of Coca-Cola for 25 cents a can, if you did the math. So I thought, like, why don't I just bring it back to my school, keep it in my locker, and then sell it to everyone for 50 cents because they don't have to walk across the street for a can of Coke, right? So I thought, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I did that. And I learned my first entrepreneurial lesson through that experience because I didn't actually make any money because I drank all the Coke. So that's lesson number one. You know, don't get high off your own supply, which is what I did.
Going back, you talked about growing up and money was a struggle for a lot of immigrant families. I am also from an immigrant family from China, and I just remember that my family also struggled a lot growing up with our finances. This kind of brings me to my next point, is I think the art of entrepreneurship sometimes requires you to have a will, something that drives you. And for a lot of people, it's not necessarily just the passion, but a need to also make money and to survive. I think growing up in an environment where there's actually a need, where you understand the importance of money, can actually drive us one step further in starting our adventure for entrepreneurship. So my next question for you, Pei, is how did your post-secondary experience lead you to where you are today? Tell us about the creation of Venue.
In university, I was mostly raised by a single parent. So ever since I moved to Canada, it was my mom who financed my childhood, including my university. So she saved up enough to pay for first year university, but that was basically it. I think she was able to pay for living and education first year, and then she was only able to pay for the tuition second year. And after that, I was on my own. So I knew early on that like I needed to find a way to make money. So after first year, I took on internships every summer. And after second year, I took on like a 16-month internship, which was enough to pay for basically the rest of university. And during that time, I was also very exposed to hackathons, which is why like entrepreneurship, instead of being like a fantasy, it became something that was tangible because I met other people who trying to do it. I met other people who actually did it, right? All the speakers at hackathons, a lot of the people you meet there, they have their stories of creating like some product and then raising money and then selling that. So I knew that's what I wanted to do, but I had no idea how to get started because it just seemed so outlandish still, even though it became more realistic in the sense that people around me could do it. I think that my first exposure to like the skills I needed to do it came when I dropped out of school to work at Wealthsimple. And through Wealthsimple, I learned how to be a better engineer, but also I took on a project with one of my friends at Wealthsimple for a startup. And he was more on the business side. So it was more comfortable for me. Like I didn't have to understand everything. I just had to know how to create the product. From there, I quit Wealthsimple to work on that company full time. And eventually that company didn't work out. I left the company. I did a few months of travel, but during that travel, I was working on freelance contracts, and those contracts gave me enough income to sustain that like nomad lifestyle for as long as I wanted. And that was like pre-COVID, right? So it was like, it was not a really common thing back then, but I think because those contracts kept growing, it gave me the idea that like I could turn this into a business. So that was the first company that I was leading and I made money off of.
Describe the moment when you realized that there was a business need, a demand for venue. What was that
Yeah.
moment like?
I think Venue, it was very clear that there was a business need for it because CodeMo was a company that I started myself. That was the consulting company that I created while traveling. And I did that for a year and a half, 2 years. And one day, pandemic hit. When all the companies are trying to survive and save money, the first thing they cut is going to be contractors because we're charging pretty expensive fees for our services, right? Around that time, my current co-founders, they actually asked me to join them and create Venue. And it was very obvious there was a need because the first version of Venue was meant to be a virtual events platform. So like Hopin. And back in the beginning of 2020, there was no clear player. It was not clear who was going to win. Hopin was still very new. They were the biggest player, yes, but the reason why we wanted to start Venue was our co-founder, Jason, he ran virtual events and he used Hopin and he didn't like it. He thought it could be done better. So, we have engineers, like we know how to run product. Like, why can't we just do it ourselves? So that's kind of how Venue got started. The need was just in our face.
I love it. And now going back to venue, and let's dive a little bit deep into managing, hiring, and retaining talent. So, yes, and then the pandemic hit, which made the talent landscape very interesting in Canada. So, what are some tips you have for founders to hire and retain the best talent? So, why should someone come and work for Venue or a startup?
I think the short answer is that it's not for everybody, right? It's not just about like, oh, like you want to work for Venue and you're a good engineer, we'll take you. It goes both ways. It's not just like, why should you work for Venue, but also like, why should we hire you? Because it's not just like that you're a good developer. We need more than just your ability to code. There is naturally like a fit that needs to exist between the two of us. And that fit very much includes things like how you view work, right? And what your risk tolerance is. There's a lot of developers that I've talked to in the last few years, not just for Venue, but for Code Mode as well, that didn't want to join me. And the biggest reasons were always like, one, you don't pay enough. That's a very common one. And two is that it's too much risk. And those are valid points, but that's kind of the nature of why you would choose to work for a startup in the first place. I have to convince you to take on more risk than you're comfortable with, or that I have to pay you as much as like a Facebook, then chances are not only am I not the right fit for you, you're also not the right fit for me. Because yeah, the kind of person that should be working at a startup is not the kind of person that refuses to take that level of risk and refuses to make sacrifices or compromises, right? The whole point of working at an early stage startup as an employee, aside from like if you're looking purely at the monetary gains, right? Is you're trading short-term income for potential long-term gain. You're really increasing the ceiling on how much money you can potentially make. Right? Like if you're working for a typical tech company, say in Canada, you'll get like 50K of equity, and if the company blows up, at most you'll have a few $100,000, but it's not the same as if you're joining a tech company when it's less than 10 people. And that's the trade-off you're making. And so many people I've talked to, they say they want to join a startup, but they want me to de-risk the act of joining a startup for them. They want me to pay them as much as any other company, or they want me to guarantee that their equity is going to be worth something. And I'm like, how can I do that for you? I can't even do that for myself, right? I can't even pay myself an amount to de-risk myself. I can't promise myself that my equity is going to be worth something. And I know that. That's the risk I'm taking.
I think the startup world is a completely different world compared to the corporate world. And I think it requires a totally different set of mindset in order to thrive working in a startup world versus when I hire for staffs at Illuminate, the one thing that I'm looking for is, are you comfortable with change? Are you adaptable? So what tips do you have for individuals to improve their adaptability?
The ability to learn and be comfortable with learning new things is also a good one. And I think all kind of fits together. It's the same general theme, right? Like you want a general purpose, smart person that can just learn anything that you give them and be responsible for new things that they haven't seen before. I don't know if I can give good tips on how to become that, because a big part of it, I think, comes down to traits. A curious person is likely to be willing to learn, right? An ambitious person is likely to not give up when that learning becomes difficult. A person who has a lot of discipline will continuously go through that learning process time after time, even though things are hard. Right. So those are good traits to look for. You want that type of person to join the team. But as for how to become that person, I don't really know what to tell you. Like, I feel like if I had the answer for this, then, and it was something that anyone could implement, then everyone would love what they're doing. Everyone would be extremely successful, right?
So, love the two aspects, curiosity and the attitude to learn, which leads me to my last two questions, I think is a little bit related. So, given the, again, interesting times that we're in, what is one piece of advice you would offer to someone currently striving to attain their dream jobs? And what are the key traits and skills they should develop?
We might be talking about two different kinds of persons. One is kind of person that is currently already striving to get their dream job and they're working towards it. They've potentially already quit their job and they're learning at like a boot camp or something. And I don't have much advice for that, because I think the advice is just keep going, right? Because you've already taken on the risk, you've already made the lifestyle changes, and you'll eventually get there. You just got to not quit. I think where I have more advice is for the other type of person who is trying to get their dream job, but they haven't actually taken action yet, because taking action requires them to make a trade-off. They have to make a sacrifice. They either have to give up on maybe their social life so they can spend more time like studying, or maybe doing a nighttime boot camp, or they have to quit their job so that they can try something new, right? And most people, I think, don't do that because they're afraid of what could potentially happen. They're losing the safety net that they currently have. And they might be looking at their peers and saying like, well, if I fail, I'm going to be behind them. And I guess the advice I have for that is, one, don't compare yourself to your peers. That's the silliest reason to make the life decisions. You'll always be worse than some of your peers, and you'll always be better than some of your peers. That's life. And if your life revolves around comparing to yourself to your peers, you will always be somewhere in the middle of the pack. That's just how it is. The people who get to the front of the pack are not the kind of person that is looking around and being like, how do I beat everybody else? They found their own tricks, they found their own path, and then that allowed them to go forward quickly. So that's one. And two is, when it comes to risk, there's no way to go around it. It's just important to remember that if you can think of the worst thing that can happen realistically if you were to take on this risk, and you can accept that outcome, then you're not really taking a risk anymore. There's no unknowns, right? Like, when I quit my job to start a company, the worst thing that could happen is I fail, I go back to work, right? I don't think I can not find a job.
I love it. So to wrap this all up, 2 points. Number one, to persevere. What motivates? I think our listeners need to understand or ask themselves, what motivates you to persevere? Whether that be to learn, to explore, to treat life as an adventure. And the second piece is to have positive self-talk. So instead of asking, what if I fail? I would encourage our listeners to reverse that and ask themselves, what if I succeed? And dream about all the possibilities and actually see themselves succeeding. So thank you so much, Pei, for being on our podcast. It is such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Alina.